I sometimes refer to this as vulture socialism. So this idea that Hegel, of course, has the owl of Minerva, which reflects upon something which has already happened. Marx has the Gaelic cock, which announces the dawn, announces that this is the moment of activity. It doesn't bring about the dawn, it doesn't cause the dawn, but it makes you aware of it so that you can do something. The vulture observes a long, drawn-out process of decay and plans how to intervene in that process, studies the process, studies what's going on. If you see a sick elephant, where will the elephant fall? What will be going on when the elephant falls? What kind of fall will the elephant have? The vulture studies the decay of something and then makes a tactical decision about where and when and how to effectively intervene. I think that we need to be able to do that. I think we need a variety of difficult to acquire character traits and capacities to facilitate that. And I think to do this, we have to live differently from other people. We can't simply live like neoliberal academics live. Their form of life, their way of living conflicts with the development of these capacities and ultimately impoverishes them intellectually. The things that they do to try to develop intellectually their careers ultimately undermine their ability to grow and make them less effective. And then this produces an estrangement between the university educated people and the bulk of the rest of the population, which recognizes that the university educated people have nothing useful to offer. They have no good advice that's worth taking.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Benjamin Studebaker, Ben Studes, regular on the show, friend of the show, one of my favorite guests to talk to, PhD at Cambridge, political theorist, author of 2 books, which we've discussed on this channel, which, if only the publishers made a little cheaper, I'm sure everyone would get them. Can we just get a One Dime Radio discount, like for all the One Dime Radio listeners, just a discount? I'm sure like everyone who's listened to the episodes with you would buy them at this point.
There's going to be a paperback for Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies before the end of the year, and that should be at least a bit cheaper. But I have to write a book that's properly cheap, and at some point I will.
Noted. Today we're going to talk about a bunch of things, but really the first thing in this public segment is the question of neoliberalism, because it is a question that, or a topic that is now so normal in left circles, and it's so used to the point where its meaning is actually not even obvious anymore. It's one of these boogeyman scapegoats that everyone likes to attribute for all of the problems. You know, everything went to shit when neoliberalism started. When did neoliberalism start, though? That is kind of when. And it was something that I thought about when I started seeing people who weren't actually really that politically engaged, people in art circles who sometimes would be casually into maybe Mark Fisher here and there, would use the word neoliberalism, or they would say late stage capitalism. It became very fashionable, almost like a fashionable thing to say. And you did a talk recently with some Theory Underground folks and Platypus folks. And you also talked on Doug Lane about this, about neoliberalism. And you questioned a lot of our assumptions. So I want to get into that. Maybe just to get straight into the meat of the matter, since you don't really have to introduce yourself at this point on this show. What is your thesis on neoliberalism, and what is your criticisms of people who the way in which people use it.
Yeah, so I think neoliberalism as a term emerged out of the post 2008 crisis as a way of criticizing the system that we live under, but not calling it capitalism, because to call it capitalism would be to exclude some of the people that there was an intent to work with. There was an attempt to work with Keynesians. There was this Keynesian moment. And so a term like neoliberalism, which would seem to imply something post-Fordist or post-Keynesian, allows people who like Fordism and Keynesianism to be part of the critique. They can say what we need is a post-war kind of capitalism, or a capitalism which rhymes with or recapitulates certain aspects or elements of the post-war settlement. A new Bretton Woods, something like that. The term neoliberalism allows that kind of alliance to happen. And that's, I think, part of why it was so attractive, especially in the American system, where it's quite hard to simply be a Marxist in the academy. In many European countries, there's still a significant contingent, or there was 10 or 15 years ago, it's continuously shrinking, of serious Marxists, real Marxists who would talk about capitalism. But in the American system, there aren't very many of those people. And it was easier academically to get going with a concept like neoliberalism because those Keynesian liberals, they would allow those kinds of critiques. They saw those kinds of critiques as useful. And so when they were in editorial or peer review positions, they were more willing to give those kinds of critiques room and take them up. So neoliberalism became a very hot term initially because it allowed us to talk about problems with capitalism without being boxed into the crazy Marxist leftist box, and to talk to a somewhat larger audience of many people who might be nostalgic simply for post-war social programs. Now, the concept of neoliberalism also, I do think, emerges to some degree out of a perception of real changes having occurred over the course of the evolution of the post-war system. But in some sense, we are still in the post-war system. Certainly, we have a lot of the same institutions that were created out of the post-war settlement. We have the IMF, we have the World Bank, we have the GATT, which eventually developed into the WTO over the course of time. We have the UN even. So we have a lot of the specific liberal international institutions that were constructed at the end of the war. And we have the increase in capital mobility, which began almost immediately at the end of the war. The first round of GATT was brought in 1947, before the 40s were even over. This effort to reduce trade barriers and get money moving around the world again was already underway. So what I like to suggest is that the Keynesians never really succeeded in constructing the system that they wanted. If you look at, say, what Keynes's position was in the Bretton Woods Conference, the Keynesians never actually got what they wanted. They had to make a compromise. And there were other liberal internationalists who wanted a much thicker kind of political union at the center of the system, people like Clarence Streit, who were calling for a union of all of the European democracies with the United States into one big federal system. There was a lot of chatter about that in the late 30s and into the 40s. But over the course of the war, national identification intensified. That kind of political union became much less possible. And there was a settlement for a kind of alliance system which preserved to some degree the sovereignty of the states and their separateness from one another. And then as a consequence of that, you had a continuous rounds of negotiations among states which were still politically distinct about how to facilitate economic integration without that political integration, which they had sworn off and decided they weren't going to do. And that's really, I think, the whole story of the post-World War II era. But it's a story that has chapters to it. It has chapters to it because this reopening of trade, this reopening of capital mobility happened gradually, and it has all of these moments in it. And so what people will tend to do is they'll tend to say at a certain point, the post-war system, the Fordist system, the Keynesian system becomes something else. And they'll use that moment, that event, as the index point. But what I would say is that's the point at which arguably we become conscious of the shift, because the shift is intense enough and visible enough that we're able to talk about it as a shift. but it's something that was happening even from the very beginning. Even during the Bretton Woods conference, they were not able ultimately to get what they wanted. And so they were fighting a rearguard action to defend something which was continuously unraveling from the moment at which it was created.
So to clarify, though, you do think that neoliberalism is a meaningful category to some extent? Because, like, generally when people say it emerged, they like to attribute the word itself being used by Milton Friedman, because he did use the word, and they attribute it usually to, if I were to broadly summarize what neoliberalism is, it's to some extent, a return to classical liberalism to roll back the welfare state of embedded liberalism, being welfare capitalism, the components of social democracy that were seen to be hindrances on the mobility and power of capital, to have those sort of deregulatory, more free market policies, but with a strong superimposed state to oversee the inevitable problems that might occur. So, like with neoliberalism, there is this deregulation and kind of retreat of the state in some regard from, for example, nationalized industries, planning, price manipulation, various things that were seen to be like interferences in the market, but at the same time, an enhancement of the police force, because there's huge crime that ensued, and it was seen as a corrective, and various other correctives to the free market. So there's also a state policy involved. But the big thing is, I think, globalization. People like to also associate with neoliberalism, and a lot of the chronology that I've read on it. For example, David Harvey was the first book I remember reading, like way back, on the history of neoliberalism, and he points out how these ideas started with Hayek and Mises, even though Mises is different, but how, like, they would go, the Austrian school, right? They would go and point out to a bunch of people saying, look at all this red tape, all these unnecessary barriers on trade, on industry. If we took this off, we would see vast flourishing. And like those ideas get adopted later when the post-war consensus starts to fall apart due to OPEC and due to inflation and various contradictions. But I think, do you think it actually was a thing? For me, I actually do think it is a thing. However, what I think this chronology gets wrong is it misses the whole left-wing origins. And that I believe there's a huge left-wing origin of neoliberalism that leftists love to completely leave out, which is that, like, really the first parties to implement these sort of changes are like the Australian Labour Party in the 1970s and the Labour Party in England before Thatcher to some extent, and Carter, right, in the United States. He does deregulation before Reagan does. He puts Paul Volcker as chairman. I think there is a real thing there with neoliberalism, the new stage of capitalism. Whether it's still the stage of capitalism now, we can get into after, because that's a whole other debate. But do you think it actually is a meaningful category, or is this just a nebulous word that is a substitute for capitalism itself?
In the past, I've been willing to use it when it's been used in a way that's clear, that is to do with the economy, where somebody is at least willing to say where it begins, and they're willing to associate it with the kinds of things that I think one might plausibly want to associate it with. The trouble is that I think oftentimes we get into this debate about where it started. And I think we have to remember that Hayek, it's not simply that Hayek became a big deal in the 70s. This narrative that Hayek was treated like a crazy person, and then he becomes a big deal in the 70s, and then neoliberalism happens then as a consequence of his becoming a big deal. There's some truth to this in terms of course, if you read, say, the Hacker and Pearson book, Winner Take All Politics, an enormous mobilization on the part of rich people in the 70s in response to the inflation and the shocks. But even before the inflation shocks of 73, 74, and 79, you've also got the Nixon shock in 71, which predates that mobilization and took apart the Bretton Woods system, as a currency system. So By the time you get to Carter, you're already well into the breakup of the post-war settlement in the sense that the currency system is gone. Nixon has already destroyed it. Nixon, who was associated with regulation, and so is often associated with the deepening of the post-war settlement. He's responsible, for instance, for a lot of the clean energy, clean air, environmental regulation in the early 70s. Nonetheless, he's the one who rips apart the currency system that they created at the conference. And then even prior to this, you have the trade rounds, these GATT trade rounds, which were about lowering tariffs, making it much easier to move money around the world. And you had also a significant amount of automation that occurred and technological development in factories that occurred in the 50s and 60s. So that by the time you got to the 70s, it wasn't really necessary for nearly as many people to work in manufacturing. And it was significantly easier to manufacture in first Germany and Japan. And then Nixon opened the door to trade with China through the settlement with China. And then the Nixon going to China settlement opened the possibility of extraordinarily cheap manufactured goods made in Asia. So not only was the American worker made to compete first with the Germans and Japanese, and then with the Chinese, even before the creation of the WTO, this stuff was in motion. Even before Carter, this stuff was in motion. And so what I'm trying to recover here is the horizon of what the Keynesians thought they could potentially do. To recognize that we never even got that project, that never even happened. They were never able to create the union of democracies that would have the Bankor system. And every time there's a major crisis, there's a significant chunk of Keynesians who go, we have to actually try the thing that Keynes proposed. And they'll make this call for a new Bretton Woods settlement to bring back not the original Bretton Woods system, but the system that Keynes proposed, which is different from what they eventually agreed to. And so I do think that the concept of neoliberalism had a certain political tactical functionality at a time when there was a significant number of Keynesians who potentially could work with socialists on certain issues or on certain responses, perhaps, to 2008. Certainly, in terms of anti-austerity politics, Keynesians and socialists were very often on the same side in those debates. But now there really aren't any of those kinds of Keynesians in any of the major political parties in any of the Western democracies. You don't have a sizable number of people at this point in the Democratic Party or in center-left parties around the world calling for the reconstitution of the welfare state, calling for revitalizing the healthcare system. You have in the UK, for instance, Keir Starmer gradually privatizing the NHS. You have, at this point, many Labour politicians, many center-left politicians who have a defeatist attitude about all of those old institutions and structures. And you've got, at this point, a trade war that's being fought. So I don't know that the concept of neoliberalism is still useful. I've always thought that it had a certain limit to it because it tended to create a very sharp boundary between two worlds that, of course, the one was created by the other and grew out of and was generated from the other. And so it erects this very sharp barrier. And then even then, this barrier is mobile. Depending on who you talk to, it's in different places. So some people will say neoliberalism doesn't really happen until even the Democrats are neoliberals. And they'll identify that with Clinton or with Dukakis. And then some people will say it doesn't happen until the WTO. So they'll put it in 86. And then some people will say it doesn't happen until Reagan wins re-election. So put it in 84. Or they'll say when Reagan and Thatcher first came in 79, in 80. Or they'll say, no, Jimmy Carter started it. Or they'll go back to the Nixon shot and the destruction of Bretton Woods. You can keep pushing this further and further back. And I think if you do this exercise, what you eventually discover is that there never was a Fordist system in the sense in which it was thought to exist. And this is where your point about the left's role in this is really critical. The left thought that the Fordist system existed. The left thought that there was a total society that had been created on something. This is where people like Althusser become a huge deal, that you had this really tight system with a state that was dominating all of the social structures, had all these ideological apparatuses that hand in glove fit into it. And particularly in states like France or Germany, where you have a very centralized apparatus in a state like a region like Paris, it was easier, I think, to have this kind of narrative of how it worked. But even in the post-war era, there were theorists who said it's much more pluralistic than this. People like Robert Dahl. It was always a little bit of an oversimplified story of what happened. And I think we often end up discussing it this way because we on the left don't spend enough time digging into the intra-liberal disagreements that existed not simply between what we might think of as a monolithic Keynesian liberal, social liberal crowd and the Austrians or the neoliberals, but which also existed within what we think of today as the Keynesian crowd. So, for instance, we had the neoclassical synthesis. So the bringing into Keynesian economics of classical economics, which happens before the concept of neoliberalism is developed and is a kind of proto-neoliberalism. It's already this view that Keynesianism needs classical economics and can't do without
Happens
it.
in socialism too.
Right. Happens even
With
in states.
yeah, it happens in the Soviet states, which is really interesting because there's reform movements that want to introduce degrees of marketization to the Soviet system. Then with that, you have different variants. Some of them are much more pro-marketization than other variants. A lot of these economists come out of Hungary, especially, right? There's one in particular, I forget his name, but he wrote a famous book called basically like why socialism wasn't working. And it was a pretty actually sophisticated book. It's not an easy one to refute. And yeah, there's this book called Markets in the Name of Socialism, The Left-Wing Origins of Neoliberalism, which details this about the ways in which classical economics was not only getting involved in Keynesian thought, but it was also involved with socialist Marxist thought. And how a lot of like even classical economists weren't this picture of unabashed capitalist, greed is good, Gordon Gekko, Milton Friedman unapologetically privatize everything. But there were some like classical economists who straight up called themselves socialists. They found themselves to be socialists and believed that this was the way to a utopian society of abundance.
And UBI was often proposed, universal basic income, in this kind of valence as a mechanism for destatifying society and giving people more choice about how to consume the surplus. People like Andre Gors, people who were on the left, backed UBI, not just as a mechanism for giving people more resources or doing redistribution, also as a mechanism for destatifying the economy and giving people more freedom to choose what to do with social resources. And this came out of the opposition to conformity, the opposition to the total society that was all running through the New Left in the 50s and 60s. There was this sense that the state not only was economically stultifying in various ways, but that it was socially, culturally too oppressive, that it imposed too limited a framework. And we still see that in terms of the social and cultural politics of the left, which still operates from the premise that all of these more what we think of as traditional or conservative social institutions, but are really in many cases just the institutions of the 50s. They're not deeply antique. That these social structures, rather than performing some potentially positive role, are just ideological apparatuses and just have the function of reproducing some kind of total structure. And that is still opposition to what is thought to be the Keynesian system, but which the Keynesians themselves never felt they had successfully pulled off.
That's the perfect example of that is Marcuse, right? Marcuse, when he's writing One Dimensional Man, I always like to contextualize how funny it is that he's writing about like the time in which a lot of people today are nostalgic for, like people on the right, even people on the right who romanticize the 50s style corporatism, and people on the left who think of Roosevelt not as a corporatist, but as some kind of like proto-social democrat. And you know what I mean by corporatism, as in this, you already know what I mean, but for the audience, as in the state collaborating essentially with business and unions together to force them to make a sort of agreement, as opposed to unilaterally backing one or the other. But it's very much a state project as opposed to a pro-worker project. And Marcuse is writing about this period so scathingly. It's talking about like the welfare and warfare state, how they're two sides of the same coin, and how like the welfare state is like the soft power of control and the warfare state's the hard power. And it is interesting that eventually people who are critics of the state, it's not hard to see why they might see like marketization at that time is very liberating. And I think a good example of someone who illuminates this sort of contradiction, and I have a lot of problem with his documentaries, but Curtis's documentaries, I think it's called The Trap. That one I like quite a bit because, but it does show that there's a lot of people who believed in this new society of like deregulation and marketization, and a lot of it were like former hippies who got attracted to this idea that actually maybe technology is the way. Maybe the government is just in the way of everything, and we need to have technology be let free, let people be creative. And it's not hard to see why what we think today is like so dystopian and right wing actually would have a lot of appeal with leftists. And
Yeah,
it's,
that's the sense in which
yeah.
Nick Land can be framed as a right delusion.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, he was for sure. He was for sure.
Yeah. I think people forget that among the Keynesians, there were statists who wanted to do the state corporatism. There were also among the Keynesians internationalists who felt that the international settlement after the war ended was inadequate to actually support the system that they were looking to create. For many of them, nationalism and nation statism keeps alive a possibility of world war and produces conflict dynamics that make it difficult to sustain a currency system that can produce stability in the long term. And so many of those guys were for a kind of political internationalism that was much, much more serious than what we eventually got. And in that regard, they're not that different from Trots. There is a kind of Keynesian Trot who thinks that what you really need is political union at the level of the world, that the UN is not sufficient because it doesn't produce this, that the UN either has to be reformed or you have to create something else ultimately out of it. And these guys lost. The real losers in history, because they lost first to Keynesians who were more accommodationist with regard to the state, and they lost from conservative elements that were not willing to go this far, and they lost to a left that viewed all of this as very scary. What, you make a world system and it's not on the basis of socialism, but is on the basis of bureaucratic management? How would you try to do socialism within such a framework? Could you do socialism in such a framework? This idea that instead of the socialists creating the world system, that Keynesian managers would make it? Could you organize within something like that socially? Would that be possible? Yeah. It kicked up a lot of really interesting debates. And I think that the 30s and 40s are a really interesting time period that we tend to think about less because neoliberalism tends to put our focus on the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But we're still dealing with a lot of the debates about how do you avoid war that were very obvious, of great obvious importance to people in the greatest generation and older. This idea that the point of this system is to stop a world war from happening. And if you structure it badly, it won't work and you'll get another one. So you better get it right. This is something that's faded for us because it's been so long since there's been a world war that we don't take that seriously in the way that we used to. And many of the people who think they take it seriously just flippantly throw it out. Anytime there's anything going on, they go, oh my God, there could be World War III. They just throw it out all the time. They don't think seriously with it because it's scary and totalizing and so horrifying. But people in the earlier part of the 20th century really thought seriously about how do we make institutions and structures that provide for real everlasting peace, because at this point we have weapons systems that are too terrible to settle for anything less than that.
I think globalization and neoliberal policy could be viewed a little separately, even though they're often lumped in together, but they intersect. And it's because globalization comes just as much from left wing social democrats, if not more. than the neoliberals that are supposedly so antithetical to them. And as we're pointing out, they overlap much more than they would like to admit historically. A good example of this is Mitterrand in France. He's like a socialist, right? He runs a very radical campaign, and he's like really the first successful French president at the level of being reelected since de Gaulle. And he's a self-described socialist, which is a big deal. Now, he is the guy who basically helps create the proto-EU. Like, he sets the stage for what would later become the EU, the Economic Trade Partnership. I forget exactly what it's called, but basically the infrastructure that would pave the way for that. And this was framed as something as like radically egalitarian or utopian to some extent, in that imagine the cooperation between everybody and free flow of goods and higher living standards. And there's some
Eurocommunism.
yeah, there's some extent to which like what communism promises, capitalism also promises and did better, at least at the level of like actually existing communism and capitalism, because of course what called itself communism was state socialism in the Soviet Union, right? So these are difficult terms to compare with, because capitalism, when it comes to like abundance, has proven to be the best. And now we're actually reconsidering, like everybody, left, right, and center, as to whether too much abundance is actually good. There's degrowth, right? And then you have people like Ezra Klein, which I think who I think is a very interesting figure, because he was somebody who was often called the neoliberal before, but he comes out with this book called Abundance, defending it and advocating something that looks very different from the system of before, yet also doubles down on a lot of the things associated with it, like globalization, trade, markets, but he believes in more state management and various other policies that are like pragmatic. But it's an interesting shift, because I want to get into this topic as to whether we're witnessing the end of neoliberalism, because many people have argued that Trump is basically the final nail in the coffin of the neoliberal world order. And you have people, further evidence of this is former neoliberals gradually jumping ship. And we saw this before with Paul Krugman, right? Kind of Paul Krugman was somebody who much more defended policies we associate with neoliberalism, to then now becoming Keynesians, neo-Keynesians. And some people like Joseph Stiglitz were also former neoliberals, with Jeffrey Sachs, major neoliberal, generally considered. Shifting their positions could be seen as evidence of this order crumbling. Now, whether that's the case, I'll let you answer. I think something is changing regardless, in that like what we thought we were fighting with this neoliberalism is clearly something very different from, whatever the hell changed in the 70s and 80s. And I find it interesting, may I add, that I've seen a lot of friends of mine and acquaintances who are very new to politics, who are just now like getting into neoliberalism as the critiques of it. So I see a lot of people who I know reading Quinn Sublodian, Globalists, the book, which is, I will say, one of the more well-written books on like the history of neoliberalism and its differences within it, and David Harvey and stuff like that. And it's interesting to see, because you have seemingly a surge of awareness of people aware of this neoliberalism thing, yet it feels like it's already vanished. It no longer even exists. Are we witnessing the end of neoliberalism in your end, if there was such a thing? Or like clearly something has changed, some new world order has changed?
Yeah, many Keynesians were and always have been globalists. So if we're talking about Keynesianism and globalism, it's not obvious that they can't go together. And indeed, Reagan did a stimulus package in '83. People associated with neoliberalism have often done state interventions and have often used Keynesian tools, especially in emergencies, especially in crises. I think that what the question that the tariffs raise is, are we going to go to a world that is much more autarkic, where trade is a much lower percentage of global GDP than it currently is? Right now, trade as a percentage of global GDP is roughly the same as it was a decade. It hasn't really changed very much, despite things like the pandemic, despite the previous rounds of tariffs and trade war. It hasn't really changed. So this raises the question of, are we seeing the kind of disruption that would really sharply reduce trade as a percentage of global GDP? Or are we seeing states change their trading partners and put different emphasis on different countries to try to pick winners and losers, to try to reward friends and maybe punish states that are considered untrustworthy or unfriendly? I tend to view it in those terms. I think the United States has been concerned since Barack Obama, since the pivot to Asia, at least, with the rise of China and with its dependence, especially in industries related to security and defense, on Chinese manufacturing. So I think there is an attempt, and it's a bipartisan attempt. And in the Abundance book, also an emphasis on the states supporting the growth of certain kinds of industry, I think particularly industries related to security and defense, an emphasis on the part of both parties on reshoring defense-related industry, and then friendshoring lots of other kinds of industry that are currently located in China, but could instead be located in other states that could be part of a new containment ring around China. So states like Indonesia, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, these states compete with China in the sense that for them to grow, they would need to produce a lot more than they currently produce. These are economies that have not really properly fully industrialized yet. So they have a lot of growth room that can come purely from building up an industrial base. And many of these states would like to be Korea or Japan, given the opportunity. They would like an opportunity to develop in that direction. Or in the case of a big state like India or Indonesia, maybe to be more like China, ultimately, eventually. So there's a lot of interest in those states, and then also in some Latin American states, in potentially becoming producers for the American consumer market. Because if those states are instead buddied up with China, then they're in a position of having to import what China produces, and their domestic industry won't really get off the ground. They won't really be able to industrialize. So for those states, there's a significant economic reason to be interested in a possible restructuring of the global supply chains. But that restructuring could be compatible still with there being an enormous amount of trade taking place, with an enormous amount of sweatshop, deunionized labor in poorer developing states. But we would change which states are doing that work and redistribute those jobs to other states in the world system. That's one of the ways this could go. And I think if that happened, it would involve a certain amount of disruption. And that disruption would be politically, I think, very costly to the president, but might ultimately, nonetheless, get the United States what it wants in terms of a global trade system that is less focused around China, is less Sino-centric. Now, there are other aspects to what we call neoliberalism, like, for instance, the state's role in the economy. For the state to take on a much larger role, I think there would need to be some increase in the fiscal capacity of these states. There would have to be some increase in their capacity to tax. Right now, they compete too much for jobs and investment with each other to be able to simply claw resources from rich people and move them around and redistribute them very easily. If they do that, if they claw resources from rich people by any mechanism, whether we're talking about tax, or we're talking about QE, or we're talking about inflation, any mechanism which would claw money back from the rich will generate a response in the rich where the rich will tend to move their money to other markets. And that will tend to produce political consequences, which make it hard for the government to continue to win elections. That's been the kind of hard logic of neoliberalism. So to me, to get out of neoliberalism, we'd either need to see there be much less trade, much less capital mobility, and then relatedly, this would have to make it much harder for rich people to hop countries in response to economic policies they don't like, so that it would become actually possible to seize their capital and redistribute it and use it for other kinds of social purposes. And I don't really see that happening. Certainly, the state can do certain things to try to encourage the reshoring of defense-related industries. And I think the United States is doing that. The Biden administration was doing that with the Taiwanese semiconductor plant that it's been building in Arizona. This stuff has been going on for a long time now. And I think there will be some of that. But is that enough to really mean the end of neoliberalism? Not if we are associating neoliberalism with trade as a percentage of global GDP or with the state's overall capacity to redistribute resources or to make very large scale investments in the hard infrastructure of the country. But some people, I think, are not associating neoliberalism with these kinds of very big, very stiff criteria, but instead with other stuff that's looser, say just the ideology or the language that American politicians use,
I
or
think a big
with
part of it is
the
tariffs and
WTO.
global. Yeah, I would say a big part of it's the tariffs and the globalization, because like, the clear difference being Clinton or Democrats or even anti-Trump Republicans talking about the need to preserve the world order and respect our allies and keep tariffs low,
Yeah, but if
compared to
the upshot
Trump's.
of it is that global trade as a percentage of global GDP doesn't go down, if it doesn't go down, then we'll just see a reconfiguring and people will change teams or change roles, but you'll still have a very integrated system with a lot of mobility and a lot of trade. Do
I see
people
what you're
really think
saying.
we're
So
going to become autarkic?
I'm not so sure about that, but there is on both the right and parts of the left a kind of desire to move back to a time of more self-sufficiency. On the right, it's a kind of anti-migrant push as well as a anti-China push. On the left, there's always been this case, really big since COVID, that we shouldn't be depending on international supply chains. So there's that, and I think those are like left and right reactions to this, reasons for opposing this sort of system. But if I understand you correctly, what you're basically saying is that what Trump's policies are doing isn't so much bringing America out of the international world order, nor is it really changing the fundamental international world system that much. Rather, he is merely shifting the alliances away from China and towards East Asia. Is that, if I understand it correctly, and getting Europe to maybe rely on itself?
Yeah, the term I like to use, and this is the horizon for it, would be neoliberalism without China. So neoliberalism, China playing a much smaller role in the global economy than it currently plays, at the very least having a much smaller role in production than its current role. And this pivot to Asia requires the deployment of American military resources in the Pacific rather than in Europe and in the Middle East, which means it requires more European and Middle Eastern military operation. The United States is happy to build the weapons to support that, but it wants the European and Middle Eastern states to increase defense spending, purchase US weapons, and then provide security. And in this way, the amount that is spent on defense can increase without the US defense budget increasing. And this permits potentially a tax cut while the defense budget in real terms becomes much larger because you'll have European and Middle Eastern countries making contributions effectively to the defense budget. And the strategy for doing that is to big up Russia and Iran as threats in those regions. So if you're in Europe, you need to spend because otherwise, maybe the United States won't stop the Russians. And if you're in the Middle East, you need to spend because otherwise, maybe the United States won't stop the Iranians because the United States is focused on Asia now. It's not going to be so focused on you. And if you don't step up, it's not going to solve problems for you anymore. It might do it for now, but there's a sense, an acute sense that there's a limit to how much the United States is willing to do this going forward, unless a larger contribution is made from those states to the American military apparatus. And we saw this even in the text chain debate, the text chain conversation about the strikes in Yemen, where Vance is the one person going, I don't want to provide security for the Europeans. And everyone else goes, come on, Vance, nobody else can do this except for us. The Europeans, they don't have the capacity to do it. Vance goes, I don't like it, but I'll go along. And a lot of people focused on the security leak or on the emojis and the silliness of the communication. But there's also a fundamental truth in that text chain, which is that the administration is still committed to European security. It's still willing to play policeman in the Red Sea, but it's annoyed at having to do this. And it wants the Europeans to buy more US weapons as a condition of it continuing to perform this role with the Blue Water Navy. That's where I see it going. Now, of course, there will be efforts to prevent it from coming off. And there are levels of degrees of success or failure that it might have, depending on how other states respond to the specific strategies and tactics that the Americans deploy. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because you could have the president have his tariff power taken away by Congress, and the whole thing wouldn't even get off the ground. The Speaker of the House protected the president from that outcome. You had enough senators and enough members of the House in the Republican caucus willing to vote to take away the power. But the Speaker of the House prevented them from moving ahead with that. And so the Speaker of the House protected the strategy. And then, in part because there was this opposition to the strategy, perhaps we saw various parts of it get delayed or put on ice for periods of time. Not all of it, because the tariffs on China, every time he pulls back on Canada or on the European states or on Asian states, he leaves any hike that he put in place on China. He doesn't back off at all on the tariffs on China, apart from the move to back off on computers and phones because of concern from the American tech sector about that stuff. Yes, so I think that there's a lot of room politically in terms of how far the administration could get with this. And there's room to talk about other strategies that could potentially be used. But the Democrats are also committed to this on some level, which is why most of them will not straightforwardly oppose tariffs, even though the media wants them to, because the media doesn't understand trade and just wants to negate Trump as vociferously as possible, because many journalists think he's an authoritarian fascist. So they want to just neg him continuously and totally, no matter what he does. There is this major constituency within the Democratic Party, has read the Pettis and Klein book, Trade Wars or Class Wars, is influenced by it, and wants to do some serious restructuring. And because of the way that the trade negotiations went during the first Trump administration, there's a lot of mistrust now in both the Democratic and the Republican Party of the Chinese diplomats. Do the Chinese diplomats have the backing of Beijing? Can they actually follow through on concessions they make in meetings? Or will Beijing roll back those concessions and often do it silently without informing the Americans and force the Americans to check the language each time, which is what they are accused of having done by the American diplomats who negotiated with them in 2019, 2020.
I have some thoughts on that book. Actually, I just started reading Trade Wars or Class Wars right when this sort of tariff war started, just to think about what was happening. So what you're saying seems to contradict perhaps the prevailing narrative that I see among a lot of people, which is that America is essentially suiciding itself, and that the big winner of all this is going to be China, because, America alienating its allies, especially Europe, will prompt those allies to seek greater ties with China. And doesn't that undermine their whole point? And the way in which Trump's policies are framed is that it's like a personality cult with policies that are just bad and confused and chaotic. The way I see it personally is that Trump is, if we're to compare to any historical epoch, I thought before like Reagan at the level of being a Reagan revolution, but I think increasingly, at least at the level of international order, like Nixon. In that Nixon tried to change the international order, but not undo it. He did completely dissolve the Bretton Woods system, essentially, with regard to the currency system. But at the level of the way in which things change in terms of interest rates and all that, ultimately, it forced a bunch of America's partners to be more reliant on the United States, and especially in Latin America. And everyone accepted it. They went along. It worked out for America. Now, perhaps what Trump is doing is a gamble to restructure the world, like you said, neoliberalism without China, or a way to simply pivot to East and isolate China. while strengthening America. Now, the question is, will this actually work? Because most people that I see seem to be convinced the opposite is true, that America is shooting itself in the foot because it's too stupid. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it depends very much on how the states ultimately react. The difficulty that China has in making friends is that what China really wants to do is to export a lot of manufactured goods to these states. And that limits states that are export oriented. What they're able to do in economic terms with China is become a customer. And that's not necessarily what a lot of these states are looking to do at this particular juncture. A lot of them are looking to strengthen their industrial base to varying degrees. China also can't really arm the Europeans in a way which makes them feel secure about the Russians. China can't really play that role. The Europeans would not trust China to manufacture weapons that they could then deploy against the Russians. So, because the United States still provides security and the Europeans are not capable of providing their own security, and because the United States imports, it consumes many European goods, there's a limit to the ability of the Europeans to defect or, say, to ally instead with China. What could happen is that the Europeans could try gradually over time to develop a more independent foreign policy by building up a European army. And this could be used to try to consolidate the European Union. But think of what that would mean for European social programs and for the European welfare state. The Europeans have struggled to keep their programs going, even as it stands. And if they increase military spending by 1 or 2% of GDP, that's going to place a very heavy burden on social systems that are already really struggling to maintain themselves at the level and quality of provision that used to be taken for granted before the 2008 crisis and before the Euro crisis. That Nixon shock crippled Europe in the long term to a very significant degree. European politics, ever since the Nixon shock, has been dominated by problems with managing the currency through the European exchange rate mechanism, ERM, and then the creation of the euro as an attempt to patch this up, and then the euro crisis as the limits of the euro were revealed, and then coming to the Americans to back up the euro because the euro was in such deep trouble that they had to do that. The Europeans have really struggled to get on an economic footing that allows them real independence. And their growth rates since 2008, but especially since the pandemic, have been abysmal, have been almost nothing, have been well below any kind of healthy or safe level for a state that's looking to develop independence. So the question for the Europeans is, where are they going to get the growth from? How are they going to grow their economies such that they would even have the choice of becoming independent? And I think this is something that, unfortunately, is one of the realities that the Europeans face. Their situation has changed over the course of the last 50 years. It's not simply that they've declined as a consequence of the world wars. They've declined as a consequence of the taking apart of Bretton Woods and the privileged position that Bretton Woods put the Europeans in. They had access to credit through the favorable IMF loan terms, through a favorable US policy in the 50s and 60s. And that policy was wound down and ended so that European countries, when they go to organizations like the IMF in the 70s, are facing terms that look more like those of their former colonies. So they became much more restricted in what they could do. And what Mitterrand tried to do was to come up with a European system that would enable the Europeans to nonetheless still be able to exercise independence. Gaullism was also part of this strategy of trying to build some level of an independent European base. But the conditions for that haven't yet materialized. And it's hard to see where the growth will come from to support that. So the gamble that the Americans are taking is that it's still the case that the Europeans don't have anyone else to turn to, that the Middle Eastern states don't have anybody else that they can turn to, ultimately, as the provider of security and as the provider of growth, as the market for what they do make. And this means that their ability to go into an alliance system with China is limited. Certainly, these states can opportunistically look for loans from China. They can try to participate in Chinese institutions that are being constructed through BRICS and they can look for opportunities opportunistically to benefit from the construction of those institutions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can afford to put themselves in the security crosshairs of the United States. And it doesn't mean that they can necessarily afford to forego the forms of support that the Americans still do provide. And that text chain is a classic example. Even though they're talking about leaving the Europeans to fend for themselves, when the Europeans are begging them to strike the Houthis to make the Red Sea clean for European trade, the Americans still do that. And when the Americans are doing that, it's not that, oh, the Americans are backing the Israelis. They're doing that for the Europeans. It's because the Europeans want that done. And this is why Vance is talking about the Suez crisis. It's being thought of very much in terms of European interests and questions about the Suez Canal and the security of the Suez Canal and who's going to provide for that, which has still been a basic question in the Middle East. It's a basic question that's always operating at every point in Middle Eastern politics. Is the Suez Canal secure? And if it's not secure, who's going to fix that? Whose job is it going to be? And it's been the job of the United States ever since the United States kicked the Europeans out of the region and said, no, you're not going to provide security for the Suez anymore. We're going to do that. Because the Europeans, they tried to buddy up with Israel to secure the Suez Canal for themselves. And they tried to run that part of the world themselves without us in the 50s. And we stopped them from doing that by menacing them economically. So the Europeans, there are things that have happened in Europe and to Europe that are at this point fait accompli, that are not, people are not aware and often forget, in part because they happened so long ago, that have greatly weakened the European Union and the European states. Things like Suez, things like the Nixon shock. The Europeans have never fully recovered from any of these things. They've never recovered from the world wars themselves, of course, but also these other things that happened during the Cold War just further undermine their position in the long term. And the Euro crisis and the way in which the Ukraine war has affected the European economies being the latest examples.
So what do you think of Europe's trade plan and response and how that might work out in terms of potential scenarios? I also saw something interesting where it seems that Ukraine accepting that Trump has essentially pivoted the Washington position on support for Ukraine is now trying to win back support by framing themselves as an anti-China force, right? Like I now see like Zelensky being very anti-China. And I wonder if that's even going to work out at all. Because if America wants to build closer ties with Russia to isolate them from China, why would they back Ukraine anyway?
The United States is only open to doing that if on certain terms that the Russians have so far been unwilling to really entertain, much less come anywhere close to accepting. And the threat of the Russians can be used to get the Europeans to import more weapons from the United States and therefore to boost the U.S. defense industry. So there are significant reasons for the United States to continue to defend Ukraine geostrategically still. And the Europeans' concerns about Russia are useful to the United States insofar as these can be used to push the Europeans to spend on defense immediately right now. Whereas before the Ukraine war began, the Americans repeatedly asked the Europeans to spend more, and the Europeans would fob them off with excuses and then not up their defense spending by very much. The Ukraine war catalyzed real increases in spending and continues to have that effect. The problem is that the European allies still think that they're special. They think that they have a different status from people in other parts of the world because of their role in the Cold War and in NATO. But the Soviet Union is gone. Russia does not pose the same kind of threat to American interests that the Soviet Union posed. And so now there's an opportunity for states that are more useful from the point of view of containing China to have larger positions within the American alliance system. And the Europeans are being asked to compete with their former colonies for status and standing within the alliance structure. They're being told, no matter what you did to Nazi Germany or to the Soviet Union, the question today is, will you make a contribution today to the system? a sizable contribution competitive with those that states in East Asia are willing to make. These states, which are potentially menaced by China, this would be the American point of view, they're willing to make big commitments to get more support and more economic development. What are you willing to do? And why should we prioritize a commitment to you when you often gesture at potentially making deals with China? You import a lot of technology from China that we think is compromised, that we don't trust. You endanger the alliance system by doing this in various ways. You undermine its security. You have cut deals with the Russians at various points. You've imported their gas. You are opportunistic in the way that you trade with Russia and China when given the chance. So why should you be the priority going forward for the United States? That's the mentality, and not just of Trump, but of both administrations. It's that Trump has tried to accelerate the pivot. He's tried to move it very quickly. And when you try to move it very quickly, it increases disruption and it increases adjustment costs. And those costs generate more opposition to the change, where if it happens slowly, there would be much less anger and frustration about it. When it was happening slowly, many Europeans went along with it. When the Biden administration allowed that war to start by declining to negotiate with the Russians, the Europeans didn't go after the Biden administration for that. They were grateful to the Biden administration for its support of Ukraine. When the Biden administration did nothing when the Ukrainians, according to the official narrative, blew up Nord Stream 2, Europeans didn't go after the United States for that. They stood by and continued to back American foreign policy in their region. So in doing that, the Europeans signaled weakness to the United States. They weren't able even to raise any kind of kerfuffle in response to the destruction of a major pipeline that's a huge source of their energy and their growth possibility. And that has consequences not just while Biden is the president, but also when Trump is the president. Now, there's a real question about whether it's possible to try to accelerate it to the degree that Trump is trying to accelerate it. Is that politically sustainable? Is it economically sustainable? I think consequence of this decision is that it's overwhelmingly likely now that the Republicans will lose the midterm elections very badly in 2026. And when that happens, in 2027, if they try to do more trade war, if they try to do stuff like this, then there will be congressional opposition and the president's tariff authority will be in danger. So if that happens, that really puts a ticking clock on the administration to cut a lot of deals very quickly before those midterm elections take place. And other countries potentially know that. Other countries potentially know that the administration is on that midterms clock. I think that there are major weaknesses with the attempt to accelerate it, major vulnerabilities. If the House Speaker had not backed the president, he might already have lost the tariff authority. So there are real questions about whether this is an effective strategy for achieving the American aims. But the American aims are rational. They're aims that have been in the minds of presidents from both parties. They have been part of the grand strategy of the United States since at least 2009. And you can find theorists and scholars in the 90s and in the 2000s making arguments that something like this would become necessary. So the people who act like it's crazy, I don't think those people have really been following what's been going on. It's not crazy, but it is risky to try to move it this quickly. The assumption has generally been that this should be done gradually. The term that I've often liked to use is decoupling. If you decouple two train cars, only very slowly does the car that is behind slow down. So initially, when you first decouple the cars, they still seem to move together at almost very nearly the same speed. It takes miles for the second car to fall behind and slow down because the friction of rails is very minimal. And that was what I took the strategy to be for the longest time. The United States was looking to decouple from China over maybe a 30-year period. This is an attempt to do it so fast that it will have great cost for many people. And it increases risk of real conflict to do it this fast. So I'm not at all confident that this is the most effective strategy or approach, but it is a strategy. It's a zany risk-heavy strategy for a president who's 78 years old, doesn't think he has a lot of time left to be doing politics, and is trying to have some kind of large-scale historical legacy in a very short span of time. Whether it works depends entirely on how other states behave and react, and how much appetite there is on the part of these developing states to get the jobs that are potentially on offer if they very quickly cut deals. And if the European allies assume that these Asian states won't cut deals and try to hold out and try to impose their own terms, what they might find is that there could be a dozen states in Asia and Latin America that get sweetheart deals here, and they're left behind and miss an opportunity to get the growth they would need to gradually develop the capacity to be more independent.
You are right on that. There was a long-standing attempt to contain China, but it was usually framed as peaceful competition. And I remember even the Romney, Paul Ryan, and Obama Biden debates when there was this exchange where Obama said, these austerity policies, these cuts that you want to make, these aren't going to help us compete with China. And this debate about expanding or reducing the state was framed in terms of what will make us more competitive with China. Now, the question I ask is, it's not immediately obvious as to why America benefits from the containment of China, in that other than the obvious geopolitical influence, right? To contain China's growing geopolitical influence, to preserve unipolarity, perhaps. But aside from that, like at the level of just economic benefit between both countries, is America really threatened by China, and will America benefit from a pivot to the east away from China? Because China just has such a labor force that is willing to work for cheap still, is very skilled for a cheap labor force, produces relatively good products, reliable products at good prices. I mean, like the amount of commodities people get access to due to China is astounding. And I do wonder, will that level of access to cheap goods that so many people, not just in America, but like in Canada and Europe, have become accustomed to, will that even be sustainable if China is contained? Because I assume China is going to fight back by imposing tariffs of its own, and goods are going to at some point become pricier that come from China due to the American tariffs. To what extent can Americans even handle that? The slowdown in American wages has been really concealed by the fact that people get access to such cheap goods. Like the cheap goods really allows people to feel like they're much richer than they really are. So if with China getting increasingly less powerful at the level of exports and global trade, could a byproduct of this be Americans paying higher prices? And is that sustainable? Or do Americans maybe benefit more from a collaboration with China in which they should pursue a policy of mutual benefit?
So I certainly think if it were possible for the United States and China to cut a deal that would balance things out a bit and reduce the pressure on Americans to consume enormous amounts of stuff, and the debt load that Americans, not just the American government, but American households and businesses end up taking on to do that, certainly an agreement would be a wonderful thing. The problem is that the Americans no longer believe an agreement is possible. And that's not just the Trump administration. It's also Hillary Clinton, who there's a video of her saying that the Chinese are not operating a free market economy. They have a state-controlled economy. You can't win in a competition with them because they'll rig anything that you do, and that you have to take back the means of production. She uses this expression, take back the means of production. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean reshore to the United States. The way for this to work, if it can work, is that the friends in Asia and in Latin America have to be able and willing to step up. really comes down to not, do you believe that Americans will work in textile factories like some people have suggested in a facile way on Twitter? Depends on, do you think that the people of Indonesia, of India, of the Philippines, of Vietnam, of Peru, of Chile, of Mexico, do they have what it takes? And are they willing to cut the kind of deal that would be necessary to make this work? It's really a question about them. And we're so unused to asking about people in these places and in these parts of the world. We're so unused to thinking about them as players. But it really does come down to, is Indonesia ready? Is India ready to step up and take on the kind of role that the Americans are inviting them to take? Will they seize that opportunity? And do they have internally the kind of economy, the kind of regulatory environment, business environment that is necessary to pull that off? And that is a very difficult question to answer unless you are a specialist in the particular states that are in play. They're states that are understudied generally by most of us who follow American or Western politics. And there's a lot of them. So it might be the case that some of them are not ultimately going to be able to do it, but others might be able to do it. Could be a situation where to some degree it's pulled off, but in other further respects, it's not. There are a lot of in-between possibilities where to some degree this is pulled off, but not to the degree that the United States would like to see. And we don't know where we're going to end up in that spectrum of outcomes. It is probably not going to be the scenario that Trump and the Republicans would like to see. For one, they'd like to see much more reshoring than is really likely to happen. And also, if they push for too much reshoring, they won't offer good enough terms to the friends, and they won't be able to get the kind of deal with the friends that they need. They have to offer the Asian and Latin American states real significant job growth, manufacturing growth, industrialization, if they're going to pull this off. And if they try to reshore too many of the jobs to the United States, they won't offer good enough terms, and it won't go through. But if they're willing to give enough of these jobs to these states, then a lot of goods in the American consumer market will continue to be cheap as a consequence of the exploitation of laborers in these other Asian states and Latin American states. But many of these countries look at China and go, wouldn't it be great if we could have the kind of growth that China had? And how did China get that growth? By cutting a deal with the United States, by agreeing to be exploited heavily by the United States for half a century in exchange for high growth. And this is what's on offer again, but to somebody else.
And a lot of urbanization. If it wasn't for all those people from the rural areas in China who had to migrate due to losing a lot of benefits to the urban areas and work, would that be possible? And we should also add that China, being ruled by a communist party, actually paradoxically made it so much better at capitalism. And there's a lot of ways in which that was the case. For one, the hukou system, which allows, it's this situation where like you're given technically a home in the rural areas, but it's not exactly the best, but you're given a stable living area, and they build really robust trains that allow people to go from where they live and can live cheaply to go work in the urban areas and literally train back the same night. To do that kind of massive infrastructure policy requires enormous levels of central planning and enormous levels of state centralization that I just don't see Indonesia, especially not India, being capable of. And another
that has
big
been
thing,
how it's historically been. India has struggled with that. This Asian tiger model, can you do what Japan does? Maybe not on your own, but maybe if the Americans are actively trying to help you do it. And it is a major question. A lot of these countries have changed over the years, are not the same as they were 30 or 40 years ago. Is that enough? It's a
And there's
tough
another big
question.
factor too. It's legitimacy. So I think China's, legitimacy, which is based in its claim to be raising living standards and moving to socialism, is simultaneously a weakness and a strength in this capacity. It's the obvious weakness, which we've discussed before, is that if it stops performing, it doesn't have a basis by which it can renew legitimacy very easily without improving living standards. Just having an election to change the rulers and then say, okay, we'll deal with that now. You chose us, so you're stuck with it. They're not in that position where they can do that so easily at the federal level, of course. But their legitimacy as a communist, ruled by a communist state moving to socialism, gives them huge legitimacy in allowing the government to do what it does and allowing people to work at the ways they do. Like in China, there is a level of obedience to the state which is a little bit difficult to achieve, and it is not something that is inherent to Chinese people, contrary to popular belief. That some Westerners have this idea of Chinese people as like docile, but like history shows very much the opposite. That China is a very turbulent culture filled with rebellion. And in fact, the Cultural Revolution kind of haunts the Chinese Communist Party to this day. So it's being a communist state, however, where it can have an impetus to have people working to something, to a unified goal, is more powerful than, because when they, of course, did their reforms, they didn't justify it by saying, okay, we're going to sell our workforce to the Americans and have Americans exploit you and we're going to get rich. They didn't frame it that way. They framed it like, we're going to make America reliant on us and we're going to get rich and socialism is going to quietly develop. The social market economy, as they changed the name to, right? The socialist market economy. But that is a kind of way to legitimize a policy that is essentially like exploiting a population that I don't know how India or Indonesia could sustainably do ideologically. Because like ideology is legitimacy, right?
A lot of these states already have a significant amount of this stuff going on. It's just that they don't
Sure.
have as much of it going on as they would like. They have large numbers of people living in slums, working for peanuts, being treated appallingly. And the people who are working in the factories that have been moved out to these states are significantly better off and are considered to be in relatively good circumstances compared with the people living in the slums. So I think there is already plenty of appetite in many of these countries for industrialization because the conditions are so bad otherwise.
So what I'm bringing up with legitimacy and ideology here has more actually to do with the professional class and the bureaucrat class than the poor, actually. In that I think, like, for example, in China, when you get a lot of people become rich through these policies, what that creates is now like a huge production of elites, educated elites who are bureaucrats, elites who are capitalists. Now, how do you actually sustainably absorb those people into a stable regime? Like the Chinese Communist Party has effectively, at this point, managed to bring in the capitalists into the party by making them part of the ruling class effectively. And by also giving a lot of ideological meaning to like the managers, who the managers can justify their position as we're building the Chinese nation, we're moving to socialism. And I do notice that Dengism, as it's called, like the view that the really attempt to double down on this idea that all of this is part of the socialist transition, it appeals most to like professors and to manager types who are in a comfortable position but not quite at the top, but like it's attractive because they're not the ones who are doing the grueling labor. But that's important because what do revolutions and rebellions often come from? It's not just the masses, quote unquote, rebelling. It's elites, rogue elites leading those masses. And you need enough rogue elites for that to happen. So if you have a regime that can create enough legitimacy to absorb enough of its elites, it remains stable, whereas one in which there's too much of a conflict of elites, that can lead to destabilization. And the way I think of this is, let's say in India, because it's so diverse ethnically and there is more democracy, there just is at China compared to China. And what is stopping like a faction of the Chinese elite, like the educated elite, for example, or even factions of capital who might lose out on some of these new economic changes, from backing what are effectively radical movements that could destabilize that sort of change. And that, whereas China, I feel like right now hasn't contained these contradictions very well at this point.
At this point,
We'll
it's been
see
a
how.
while since the BJP has really been in political danger in India. Indian democracy, it's in that category of countries where we question what kind of shape
Yeah,
it's
well, I
in.
put it. I compare it to the United States in some capacity. It's like a on the inverted totalitarian scale, in that it is, formally speaking, it doesn't rig elections. There's not much evidence at all of rigging elections. Like there are fair and free elections, yet the political dominance of the BJP is so and the
Yeah, it's
level of
really a
state
question of
control.
competitiveness. Is it a competitive system where it really is possible for somebody else to win? Or has that competitiveness gone away almost for whatever reason? We could argue about fair, but what really matters is whether it's a competitive system and whether the elites in the country feel that it's a competitive system and that they really do have a capacity to compete. Because if they don't think they have a capacity to compete, it almost doesn't matter what the reason is why. This deprives them of many of the options and tools they would otherwise use. And I do want to emphasize that China is not the only success story on this front. There are other states that have successfully industrialized, like Japan, like South Korea. Now, with a significant amount, of course, of state presence in the economy, but not with, say, Chinese state socialist institutions or structures. So I do think there are a number of different kinds of models that these states can draw on. They aren't necessarily out of the running simply because they don't look like China. Now, I think the strongest case that you could make from the Chinese standpoint would be the comparison with India, because India is a country which, on paper, would seem to have a lot of the same kinds of things, but then doesn't have anything like the same institutions and has struggled to compete in practice as a consequence of its weak institutions. But there are also, even if India doesn't end up being the major winner here, there could be a lot of other states that might be in stronger positions at this stage than India to be the beneficiaries. And Indonesia is a country with a very large population at this point that many have tipped as the next big thing in Asia. And this is a country that is majority Islamic. It's a country that has a quite significant national self-conception at this stage, a country that is serious, wants to be a player, but almost never gets talked about. And I do think Indonesia is one of the states that could potentially make a play.
You recently made a series of tweets, but something along the lines of China's government playing games or essentially bluffing with regard to their strength on the tariffs, because you view their political legitimacy as actually, in fact, much weaker than it really appears to be.
Because they
And
can't
that
lose an election. Trump can do something so destructive to the US economy that he can get completely wiped out in the midterms, ultimately. And they don't have that option. So the amount of damage that their economy can take without serious political consequences, it's not obvious to me that it's as high. Whereas in the American system, we have a process for going, this guy was just really incompetent, we'll flush him out, while still retaining the effects of whatever he did. So you could say, oh, this guy was incompetent, he's useless, he's evil, he wanted to be a dictator, and you can vote him out. You can get somebody else. All of the effects of what he did will still be with you. And we saw this in the way Biden handled the trade war with China. Biden retained a lot of the things Trump did and actually deepened and furthered many of them, including even trying to ban TikTok. And he took it ultimately significantly further, while at the same time denouncing his predecessor as having been an incompetent, bad manager of the pivot, as someone who alienated allies and made it harder ultimately to do it. He could nonetheless retain a lot of what was done. And this is something that China cannot do. China doesn't have this capacity to flush discontent. And that, for that reason, China has to produce better growth rates with consistency and cannot withstand easily a period where it actually contracts. During the pandemic, the Americans really helped China by keeping their economy running while China was trying to shut it off and keep people at home. the Americans kept buying stuff for the Chinese. The Americans performed this enormous service to the Chinese economy. And this is something Pettis and Klein talk about in their book. This incredible service was performed during the pandemic. And nobody ever talks about it. But the Americans turned on their economy while China's economy was turned off. And so the whole Chinese consumer economy shut off, and the Americans stepped up, had a huge stimulus package, and just absorbed a ton of garbage for a full year.
Could that be? It's like that's more of anything just an attempt to deal with the consumer citizen that is the average American at this point. And honestly, much of people in the first world, but especially Americans, like at the level of just rates of consumption, I think COVID would have had even more psychologically horrific impacts on people if it wasn't for all of the escapism and consumerism that people had access to.
Yeah, there were ways in which it politically helped in the States. But the Americans, because they have an electoral system, could have tanked that discontent like many European states did, flushed out their government in a new set of elections. And what would China have done in that instance? If the Americans had pursued a policy of really restricting consumption and had greatly upset their public, what would have happened? Trump would have been voted out by a huge margin in 2020 if he had said, we need to shut down the economy and we need to follow a policy similar to what's being followed in Germany. It would have produced a situation in which he would have been voted out and ejected with great force, and then the American system would continue to operate. But in the Chinese case, there would suddenly be a huge consumption hole. And this would be very dangerous to the system. And we did see during that period lots of unrest in China with people stuck in buildings they didn't want to be in, trying to get out. We saw some crazy things going on in China during the pandemic that everybody's forgotten about in memory hole. People in the white suits containing populations for very long periods of time in small areas. And not just kettle zones for protesters in London or something, locking people in buildings and not letting them out, taping bus doors shut. This kind of stuff would have been a lot hairier. And insofar as it got hairy, we only heard a little bit about it because you're not going to have very open media there that's going to communicate the intensity of any kind of discontent that does arise.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is a kind of Soviet Union phenomenon. Like the Soviet Union for a long time was able to make itself seem way stronger than it actually was, because on its propaganda would make it seem like it was strong as ever. And it even fooled the Americans for a certain point in time into thinking that they posed way greater of a competitive threat than they actually did.
Khrushchev had Eisenhower thinking they had a ton of nuclear weapons. And that was part of why Eisenhower, among other reasons, told the British and the French to back off in the Suez. Wild bluffing that Khrushchev did back in the 50s. Really incredible bluffing. He had only 4 missiles and he acted like he had hundreds or thousands of them. Wild stuff that went on and presumably still does go on. We just don't know what is part of that and what is genuine and what's real. None of this is to say that I think China is in any kind of imminent trouble. I don't think that the PRC is in any imminent danger of collapse. But I do think that people who operate from the premise that the United States can't fight a trade war with China, or that what the Trump administration is doing is just crazy, I think those people have not really examined the situation. There are reasons to think that some version of this policy could be effective. Maybe not the specific version that the Trump administration is committed to. Maybe that's too fast and too intense, ultimately, to politically work. But some version of this, even the Democrats subscribe to. Even the Democrats have been gradually trying to reshore and decouple. That's at this point a hegemonic position in the United States politically. And if people don't realize that, it's because they're estranged from the American elite and don't know anything about its internal debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw a series of TV appearances of Chinese diplomats. Like one that went viral was a diplomat who said just blatantly, "We don't care. Like Americans can do what they want. China will be fine. We've existed for thousands of years as a civilization. We'll be here." And they projected this enormous strength, and a lot of people on Twitter, especially on the left, seem to be like, yes, China is going to win. America is stupid. Now,
Of course,
look,
that's what he's going to say.
of course, but there is this phenomenon of like magical thinking among the left where it's we want things to happen, so we believe they will happen. And when you make a case like what you're doing right now yourself, trying to give more nuance to the conversation, you're seen as being like a party pooper. Come on, Squidward. Why are you ruining our hopes like that? Do you want the Americans to win? Do you support American imperialism? And that's what you get framed as opposed to just being a realist. But I'm just
Part of what
saying,
people got to remember is that the United States often wins while looking terrible doing it. The Americans, their strength often comes from their worst vices. The consumption that the United States does, the horrible, obscene things that Americans do with their money, drives a lot of growth and has lifted a significant number of people around the world out of poverty. This is true. It is true because these states only grew by trading with the United States and the first world system. Now, that's not to say that was the only way it could have been done or the best way it could have been done, but it was a way. And if you don't offer a way, if there's no clear story about how a state like Indonesia or India can industrialize and get rich by interacting with you, why should that state make that decision? All of these developing states have to make tough decisions all the time about who they want to be screwed over by.
You make me want to bring the conversation to degrowth, but before that,
oh God, imagine telling developing countries that you want degrowth. Think about what a way of repulsing poor states that is. One time I was at Cambridge, I was talking to a couple of master's students from India, and they were telling me about how they think it's hilarious when Europeans talk about degrowth, especially when they have the colonizer child, Greta Thunberg, telling them that they shouldn't grow their economy, that we should stay poor because of climate change, and we should have enormous numbers of people living in slums and miserable because maybe climate change will happen. And the colonizer child is telling us this. There's no sympathy in the developing world for that kind of stuff. And it's a very first world insular attitude.
The irony is that a lot of the time degrowth is framed as being good for the first world. Good for the third world, sorry. That it is the first world who needs to degrow and not the third world. But the problem is that like the growth of the third world is bent on the consumption of the first world, which kind of contradicts that.
Who buys it? And if the first world isn't going to buy it, what do people just think that consumption doesn't require infrastructure, that consumption doesn't require marketing and a sophisticated financial system that can get credit into people's pockets? Americans believe that if they don't wear incredibly expensive toxic makeup, that they'll be ugly. Americans believe that every wall of their house needs to have art on it or it looks incomplete. Americans have internalized all kinds of cockamamie mental illness, crazy thoughts that compel them to buy garbage that nobody needs. Nobody needs. Who does need that garbage to be bought? The people working in these factories in very poor states, who, if not for the American filling his lawn up with Halloween inflatables, would be out of a job. The sickest things about American society are essential to this system as it currently operates. And if we want that to not be the case, we have to actually make a different system. We can't simply try to putz around with the trade relationships among different nation states. That's not going to end this or get us out of this. And people want it easy. They want it without them having to do anything. They want people over there in China to solve the problem for them. It's not going to happen. If you're listening to us, you're listening to us speaking in English. You have to solve the problem, people who speak English, people who listen to podcasts and videos in English. You have to be part of solving the problem. You can't be waiting for people in other parts of the world to do this for you. If you're speaking in English, then you are one of the people in a significant position in this system relative to everybody else. You got to be part of it.
100% agree. It's a kind of interpassive way of engaging with politics by being like, let's support the other team, but it's divorced from economic reality because look, what some people might have heard what you just said and think that's capitalist realism. You're just accepting the way in which the system works as right now, and that the only way for the global south to develop itself and lift people out of poverty is by selling to the first world to buy. Now, of course, you're not saying that is the only conceivable system, but that is the system that exists now. And the fact is, that is a system that China was more than willing to play along with.
And
And
he's
China,
still
in
part
fact,
of.
voluntarily got themselves in, which what
Yeah.
I find is an argument I find very fascinating that I hear a lot, which is a Marxist-Leninist way to discount social democracy. And there's all kind of arguments one can make about social democracy in the Nordic countries, but they make this very peculiar argument, which is strange because they'll say, well, they're imperialist countries. The Nordic countries are imperialist, whereas as opposed to the third world, they're exploited by imperialism. And I'm thinking, China like voluntarily exploited its own workforce to American companies and Americans who are buying the shit that's being produced in China. So what do you mean imperialism? China is like one of the biggest players in this imperialist trade system. And that is something that is, and the fact is that if we want another way for, people to be lifted out of poverty in the global south while also people consuming less, which I think we need to do. Like, this is the kind of thing I think some degree, I think like degrowth, especially for at least the upper middle class and higher, even the middle class, how is absolutely necessary. There's just too much decadence. I'm all for it. But like under the current arrangement, the irony is like, it's not first world versus third world because they're dependent on each other. Like the third world is dependent on the third world. The third world's dependent on the first world to buy it to grow. And the first world is dependent on the third world to make its bullshit for cheap. And unless you change that, like none of these kind of degrowth policies really make sense without a different system. And at the same time, one can't also hope that this is a geopolitical conflict in which one side will prevail. I always hear like the decline of the West, decline of America. And whenever I've advocated that seems naive, you get called like a jingoist or whatever. But I don't think I don't consider myself a jingoist because I think, frankly, the first world needs to consume way less.
At the very least, it needs to consume different. People in the first world need to consume the things they actually need as opposed
that's
to
what I
this
mean.
garbage.
You know what I mean?
The stuff that they're having trouble consuming, like healthcare or education, that stuff they probably need to consume more of relative
or good
to
quality food. Let's talk
Sure.
about that because it's like good quality food. There's tons of food. The quality is heinous. And the more I've gotten into the health science rabbit hole, the more I look at, good God,
And
they're actually
too.
There's the microplastics rabbit hole is a thing. I will say that, and there is some negative effects it has on all kind of development, on puberty. It's pretty horrible what's happened to food. There's this book called The End of Food. It's about like the international system and the way in which the amount of stuff that is injected to make foods more addictive, tasty, and long lasting, and all the consequences of that. And this is an international system issue. Can't just hope one side wins.
Yeah. And what is the ultimate story of the Cold War? The first world beat the second world because the third world chose the first. And it chose the first because the first offered manufacturing opportunities, industrialization opportunities. And the second world, the Soviet Union, said, buy our crap, buy the stuff that we make, support our heavy industry. Ultimately, that was the difference. In the Soviet system, you never had an opportunity to become a fully developed state. You were continuously on a drip from the Soviet Union, would keep you going, but wouldn't allow you to become a rich country. The first world offered the opportunity to China to actually manufacture. It offered opportunities to Japan, to Germany, because before China, it was Japan and Germany that were given this opportunity and availed themselves of it. That's what ultimately allowed the Americans to win. And remains the case that if you don't offer something, and what they talk about Belt and Road, they talk about investment in African states, they don't want a drip. This is the same kind of stuff the Soviet Union used to do: aid, money, some infrastructure. What these states need is to produce. They need China to import stuff that they make. China is not willing to do that. China's win-win negotiation is still within the parameters of China produces and the other states don't. That has to change if China wants to play that kind of role. And even then, you're not getting something that's really a meaningfully different system. You would just get a system that works very much like the one we presently have, with China as the anchor state doing the consumption. How is that better? How does that help anybody?
That's a really good point that makes it hard to envision a way China really pulls through out of this as a winner in any way long term. And
You got to
before
feel
we
for the
move,
Chinese workers too, because they are working their butts off and they consume so little relative to what they produce. You look at final consumption per capita. In the United States, it's about $43,000 in, I think, 2022 USD. In China, it's around 7,000. Maybe it's slightly over 7. It was slightly under last time I looked. It's 1/6 the level, roughly. That's an incredible difference. European countries, Britain, Germany, they're around 25,000, almost $20,000 less per capita than the United States. It's an incredible amount of consumption per person that occurs in the United States and only in the United States. And that means all of this stuff that is not that necessary, that's not that important to an ordinary person's life, a lot of it can only be sold to an American, because only an American can consume that much to be able to buy things that are that extraneous, that unnecessary.
if they have the wages to buy them,
The
they will still-
debt, what the Chinese have been
Sure.
doing and what many other states have been doing is flooding the United States with cheap credit so that the Americans can keep buying. And they
Well, you
are
mean it's
doing,
mainly the banks. It's mainly the banks that create the cheap credit, like the
well,
even the credit banks.
buying assets in the United States, injecting cash into the United States. There's been a continuous need to keep the Americans consuming, because that's the real danger. If the American economy really goes under, many other people around the world will feel the effect of that. And that has produced a situation where other states will do all kinds of things to keep the Americans buying. All kinds of things. Because what kind of world would we have if you cut out this consumptive engine? And that's the sense in which they think of it as a train that the United States pulls with its consumption, and everyone else gets towed along. Now, gradually, these other states can boost their ability to consume, but it's going to be easier to do that if you make a deal with the Americans to rebalance the world economy and get the Americans consuming a little bit less, so that frees up some of that investment, some of that credit for people living in other parts of the world. And the Americans are willing to do it. They're willing to make a deal that would balance it out. But many countries, when they start producing, they struggle to make the pivot to being a more consumption-heavy economy. And this is in part because the producers become entrenched interests internally. You see this in Japan. The exporters in Japan have opposed increasing consumption in Japan because it would involve wage increases, and it would make it harder for them to manufacture in Japan. So the car companies, the electronics companies that were the engine of Japanese growth, they now oppose and block the measures that would be necessary to make Japan richer. And the same thing now takes place in China, where the companies that build all of this housing, they build all of this infrastructure, the construction companies, they are in no hurry to see the wages and consumption of their workers increase. And the factories that manufacture in China, they're in no haste to see that change. And this is preventing Chinese workers from living better. It's not just a problem for American workers. It's not that the simple fairy tale of the Americans are upset with being ripped off by the people that they exploit. It's not just that. It's also that You have people in Japan, people in China, people in Germany too, who underconsume relative to what they produce and do need a world system that gives them more capacity to participate fully as consumers, so that the Americans are not constantly being chased around by debt and this predatory advertising. The financial and marketing system in the United States, the pressure it puts on people to buy garbage, it's just enormous. The psychological manipulation that goes into it and the amount of money that's spent trying to wiggle your way into American brains to get them to think that they need things. Wild. It shouldn't go on like this. It doesn't need to.
Before we move to the back room, I was just digesting this black pill you just fed me, but I want to finish a question I was asking before with regard to something you were tweeting about China's legitimacy, at least the legitimacy of their government. You seem to imply that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have enough legitimacy among its population to really build enough nationalist sentiment that could serve as a countervailing force to these tariffs to mobilize their population.
Not
To
necessarily that. I wasn't saying that there's no nationalism or an insufficient level of nationalism in China. I was just mentioning that some of these other Pacific states do have some level of nationalist commitment that can get them to rally behind their state to undertake some kind of operation of some scale. Really, my point with China is that the lack of elections gives them more limited mechanisms for letting off steam when things do get hot. And that doesn't mean that they're in danger of falling anytime soon. It just means that they do tend to have to play it more conservatively, because if they make a very serious error, their room politically to simply vote out the current set of leaders in the party, it's more limited. There's still stuff they can do in terms of getting rid of the premier, but getting rid of Xi Jinping would be difficult because of the degree to which he's entrenched himself. One of the advantages that the party structure had under Hu Jintao is that it was a little bit easier to potentially extricate yourself from somebody.
Yeah, under Deng too. Deng has paved the way for that collective party system. That was supposed to be the system. That was a system even under Mao prior to the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, and many Americans have talked about how they felt during the Hu Jintao period that they had somebody they could talk to and potentially cut a deal with, but that has changed in the more recent period. So even the possibility of having diplomacy might require some ability to change out some of the leadership periodically without the party falling and without the party state collapsing. And because that has become increasingly impossible, it's harder for the Chinese to make an argument to a new US president that they are going to adopt a different negotiating position.
That's a really good point. It does go to show that even whether you have a capitalist, socialist, or whatever system its economy is structured around, the big benefit of elections is that you're not only allowed yourself to renew legitimacy among your population, giving yourself an impetus for rule or being able to rule, but also like geopolitical negotiations, because there's this hope then with maybe something could change. And the
Americans do this all the time. They do this good cop, bad cop routine all the time, and they do it totally consciously too. They know that they're doing it. They make it out to states all the time that the next president will treat them differently. All the time, as a mechanism for trying to get states to cut deals early on. Because the next president, he might not like you. Of course, in practice, the State Department is much more consistent in its position across administration. Part of the function of the turnover is that everybody who's in office knows less about how to do the job. And that means not only that you get sometimes a little bit more incompetent decision-making, but it also means you get more variety in what can happen. Because people are willing to take chances because they haven't become jaded or made cynical by decades of seeing how it works. You get opportunities sometimes out of that.
The last question I'll ask before we go to the back room actually is something that is an elephant in the room we have to address, which is bringing up democracy. A lot of people are very concerned about the direction that's going in America, especially given the recent meeting Trump had with the El Salvadorian president, seemingly striking some sort of agreement in which people could be deported to El Salvador, which is like scary because that's like the Guantanamo Bay situation, but worse in that you now can send people to a government that's not subject to the Constitution. So it essentially can do things with people that are beyond the rule of law and our civil liberties that we cherish, which is pretty scary, not gonna lie. Like this has been happening for a while. I don't see this as something that new, and that like Guantanamo Bay was already a serious step in the kind of totalitarian direction. But I know how you view the change of democracy in America as it pertains now, as it's happening now, because if Trump's policies don't work out, right, and there's massive discontent, I think it is highly possible that he will resort more and more to really brutal forms of repression that the US up until now has used a lot of, but not to nearly the same extent as a police state has used, like Russia or a real like autocratic regime. However, it has the capabilities to do, and it could get even worse. I don't know what your views on that are, because that had a lot of people scared. The what's going to happen with that?
So I think, first of all, normatively, the immigration policies of the administration completely repulse me. I want to make that very clear. Normatively, I completely disagree with the immigration policy. Descriptively, I do not think that this is the fall of democracy in the United States. I think there are going to be midterm elections. They're going to be competitive, multi-party elections with the two major parties that are usually competitive, once again being competitive. So competitive within the framework of what usually falls under that nomenclature in the United States. I do not think that the president could suspend or get rid of those elections or even heavily taint them or reshape them in any way without potentially triggering a military coup. And I think that the president knows that. And I don't think he will attempt or even seriously entertain doing anything like that. The 2026 elections will be on the 250th anniversary of 1776, and that will impose, even more than usual, a demand for elections that the government will have to meet. And those elections will have to look like real elections as we have typically understood them in the United States. So I don't think that there is any possibility of democracy going in the United States anytime soon. I think that the things that are going on here are gross. They are similar to Britain attempting to deport immigrants to Rwanda. They are similar to Britain and Australia denationalizing their citizens on the basis of participation in what those governments regard as terrorist organizations. They're similar to Operation Wetback. They're similar to things Andrew Jackson did to Indians in early U.S. history. They bear some resemblance. Nevertheless, none of those things were incompatible with competitive multi-party elections as they've typically been understood in the American system. It was never the case that you couldn't defeat the Jacksonians at the ballot box. You could, and people did. Eventually, Martin Van Buren was defeated when he ran for re-election. The Jacksonians got 3 presidential terms in a row, 2 for Jackson and then 1 for Van Buren, and then they lost. So in the United States, we've very recently seen evidence that you can vote out Donald Trump at the ballot box and that he will whine about it, but ultimately he will comply because he knows that he doesn't have the backing in the military to try to stay in office without an electoral mandate. I believe completely that we are still in that kind of world, notwithstanding many of the horrible and repellent policies that we do see. And I ask people to remember that Barack Obama ordered drone strikes on U.S. citizens, killed them from the sky with drones. And I ask people to look at the immigration statistics and the deportation statistics. Donald Trump has so far failed to achieve the deportation numbers of the Biden administration, let alone the numbers achieved by Barack Obama in his first term, which were incredibly high relative to what we've seen. All of that context is just to make the point. It's not to excuse, it's not to justify any of it, just to make the point that in your lifetime, horrible things have happened, and yet democracy, as it's understood in the United States, has continued to function and operate. And we have every reason to think that it will continue to function and operate. And attempts to impeach the president over this stuff, at most, would just get you J.D. Vance. Just as in the first administration, the talk about Russiagate, the talk about the phone call with Zelensky, the talk about abolishing ICE, these things were not ultimately politically effective in challenging the president. The same is very likely to be true of all of this stuff. We have a lot of social science research at this point that suggests that talking about immigration in any way, positively, negatively, tends to help right-wing parties in Western politics. Regardless of what you say about it, what position you take, or what they're doing, no matter how bad it is. And so for this reason, sometimes to get attention, they do exceptionally bad things to try to get you to talk about it. And particularly during a trade war where the president is embattled politically, is having a difficult time, is concerned about mutiny in the Congress over his trade policy. If he can get you to talk about immigration, he will. And even if all of your friends agree that it's horrible and repellent, that doesn't mean that politically at scale in the United States, that's going to be the way to deal with this. And the David Brooks types who think that people are going to take to the streets over this, they're not. It's been a long time since David Brooks has really hung out in a red state. It's been a long time. And I grew up in Indiana. I know Indiana. I've been playing a game this last week asking people in Indiana if they've even heard about this, if they've even heard about the whole controversy. And a lot of them haven't even heard about it. And most of them don't care. It's not the kind of issue that mobilizes people in the parts of the country that you need to ultimately persuade and convince to be more competitive at future elections. And that's what people need to be thinking about. Instead of hoping that he will try to suspend the elections, that the military will throw him out, they should be trying to compete in those elections and win them. And the way to do that is to focus on offering a real economic alternative to him that is not just a status quo that doesn't seem to serve people. And we've been having this argument over and over again for years, where it's been necessary to say over and over, you have to beat him at the ballot box, and to do that, you have to offer a real economic alternative to him. And people would rather play other kinds of games and hope for a legal solution or a military solution to what is really a political problem tied to decades of economic failure that no one has been willing to grapple with or address. And this is still, despite how horrible the immigration policy is, yet another iteration of this, yet another case where people have an opportunity to compete with the administration, to offer an alternative economic paradigm, and are retreating from that task in a way that will not politically serve ultimately their end.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. It's a terror regime, and to act like any of this is just unprecedented. It doesn't look at the developments that have been long in the making. Yeah, I hate to leave people on the black pill, but I guess hope is cope. And look, I'll say this. It does suck to have negative news, but in a time in which there's so many media sources who all want to tell you what you want to hear, people talking about how this means the decline of the American empire, this means the rise of BRICS, China, even really the idea of BRICS now is increasingly laughable given the pivot to the east. But just so many copes, and with copes, while they make you feel good in the short term, in the long run they make you feel worse because you build your hopes up and then you get hit with real existential dread when that wears off. But without further ado, we're going to move into something that I think is a much more positive, at least more inspiring topic, perhaps, in the back room, which we're going to discuss the whole idea of monasteries and building alternative educational institutions that can help people think. If you're not a patron already, what are you doing? At this point, there's just Studebaker knows you've been in like 3 back rooms. There's just so much interesting stuff that is discussed in the back room, and I have some of my favorite discussions there, and it's really not that much. A very small fee per month, like $5. So yeah, become a patron and see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.